Hello friends, and welcome to the official kickoff of my world building series. I am so glad that quite a number of you have been excited for world building talk. Me too. The first topic is going to be creating races and species, whatever you want to call it. One of you suggested that as a first topic, and I thought that would be a good one because it kind of has a very broad view aspect to creating your characters. Like if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, one of the first things that people often think is, I want to be an elf, I want to be a dwarf, etc. This being YouTube and all, it would probably be great if I had some kind of clickbait title like the 5 things that you should never do while world building. But I feel like world building has very few hard rules. And that's part of the fun of it. Also, if you're a regular viewer here, you'll know that my own world evolved very organically, not deliberately whatsoever. I don't think that I'm the best person to be giving out generic tips for all world builders. My whole vibe here is just me having a conversation about my own world and why I made the choices I did and what I've got going on. And I wish that you were actually sitting here for me to talk to each and every one of you and share ideas. But since you're not, please feel free to use the comments. It's a lot of fun to me just to see all the different ideas and the how and the why of world building and where it ends up leading you and what questions it brings up. So that's what I'm going to muse on for a while. And if you're looking for like generic tips, this is probably not the series for you. So I'm just going to discuss some things that I would consider if I was creating a world deliberately for the first time, as well as some qualities of my own fantasy races and where they fit into the context of these questions. And we're not discussing cultures in this video. This is just universal, like physical and magical attributes. And I'm a fantasy writer, so obviously I am mostly focused on fantasy, but if you're a sci-fi writer or horror, spec fic of any kind that involves fantasy races or made-up races, you're certainly welcome to take from that and share what you've been doing. I'm Lydia Foxglove, and I've been a full-time fantasy writer for 16 years, both traditionally and indie published, and I've been working with the same fantasy world for 30 years, so I should know a thing or two. I should know a thing or two. Welcome back, and let's go. Considerations. How many races is your world gonna have? I have to say, I really do love a world that just has a bunch, where you never know what you're gonna get in the next chapter or the next book. Some little race of people with an intriguing quality that appears in the background, and then later on you get a whole character and you get to delve into it. I love it when there's just feels like a lot of different peoples in a world. But is my world like that? Not really, not anymore. It kind of used to be more like that, and I eventually pared it down to the core peoples of the world because it's also very overwhelming to have a world with a ton of different races and species. Whether you have a world with a ton of species or just a few, I certainly think it's usually wise to focus on just a few of them, or you can overwhelm the reader and you can also overwhelm yourself. I think the more you have, the more likely you're also kind of likely to fall into the trap of they're all kind of based on people and places in this world. Like, oh, here's the kind of Middle Eastern race that has a bazaar and lives in the desert, and here's, the race that seems kind of like China and Chinese culture, and personally, sometimes this can work out in a pretty cool way, like how Avatar: The Last Airbender kind of riffed off of some different Asian cultures. That was deliberate and enjoyable to me. But sometimes it also just feels kind of lazy. And I really made a huge effort to make my cultures not exact parallels of any on this planet, but we're getting into cultures. That's for another video, just focusing on the races. My world settled into having three main ones. Regardless of how many you have, I do think 3 is a good number to focus on. It's like a really sweet spot amount that they can have different conflicting or complementary attributes between, like these two agree on this and these two have a conflict. So primarily I have the Miralim, the Daramons, and the Finarlim. The Miralim and the Daramons are physically very similar, and they can have children together with no real issues whatsoever. They're that similar. They're also very similar to humans. The main difference is that they have pointed ears, because I like to draw pointed ears, which is a great reason to make a decision about the races in your world. And then you have the Familiarity, who are the created beings made with magic that are kind of like a race of doll people. They were created to be a slave race, but they have the same souls as Familiarity and Daramons, which raises many conflicts and cultural evolutions as they try to sort out this, especially the more they fully realize just how much they're basically putting their own kinsmen's souls reincarnated into the bodies of dolls. And however many you end up having, the next consideration may be the balance of power between, we're going to say, the three groups. And this might be a little different if you're writing a novel versus working on a role-playing campaign. If you're working on a role-playing campaign, clearly you're going to want to have everyone have a certain balance of power. Whereas if you're writing a novel, it might be part of the plot line that one race is much more powerful than the others. So the choices you're making about the physical abilities about these peoples will have an effect on how culture plays out later. I am not doing a role-playing game, but I still like to have kind of an equal balance of power between the races in my world. That's how it's shaken out, and I enjoy writing it. They all have very different strengths and weaknesses. The Familiarity have inherent telepathic ability, and there is some implication among the archaeologists of this world that the Familiarity may have been like the first people, like all of the oldest skeletons and settlements are all Familiarity. So there's a few different theories about whether the Daramons were like a less powerful type of Familiarity who split off culturally later, whether they were actually humans who came to the world, or maybe they were another race of people from another portal world. But the Familiarity have a little bit of that. We've got the telepathic powers, and we were kind of here first. With that said, they generally tend to be a fairly empathetic and compassionate people, not super warlike because of their telepathic powers. They can kind of feel pain from other people, sometimes more than they might like, and that does not lead them to be super warlike. But they can also kind of shut that off, and you get bad actors here and there, of course, as well as I'm sure there have been competition for terrain or resources at certain parts of history. So the Familiarity are a bit terrifying to everyone else simply because they can read your mind, they can control your mind, they can heal themselves. I mean, not all of them can because their powers vary widely, but at least some of them can, enough for it to be scary. And for most of history, the Daramons had a great disadvantage against the Familiarity whenever there was a conflict of any kind. The Daramons are a little more like humans. They can use like elemental sorcery, they can make potions, they can do lots of magical things, but it's somewhat understood that everyone can use this power and that it kind of comes from the crystals that are in the planet's core. So it's not really a huge advantage to them, it's just that they've developed their sorcery a little bit more because they don't have telepathy. This all changes with the appointment of Lord Jaren as kind of the spiritual leader. He's called the Hand of Fate. He's very charismatic, he gets a rather cult-like following, and because of this, he is able to inspire enough sorcerers to gather together and sacrifice themselves to create a absolutely massive act of sorcery that enchants the blood of every Daramon in the world so that it has magical properties. And if they get like shot in the heart or something, their blood will kind of keep them alive until they can be healed for a certain time period. But it's enough that usually a healer can get to you, fix you up. It's just really hard to kill them once the 10,000 man sacrifice has occurred. So now you have the Familiarity that have these telepathic powers, but they can still be shot in the heart or shot in the brain, and they'll be dead within seconds, just like a human, if they don't have like some mega healing power inherent to them, which very few of them have that kind of power. Whereas the Daramons, you can just, pepper them with bullets and they'll keep going for a little while. And then you have the Familiarity, who are not physically strong whatsoever. They have kind of slow reflexes. They're very easy to physically dominate, but they are impervious to cold, heat, poison, various potions that the Familiarity and Daramons are using on each other. If you shoot one of them in the heart, it's barely going to bother them because they don't even have a heart. They just have stuffing. They only feel pain in the immediate moment. Like if you whack their arm off, they'd feel like a flash of pain and then it'd be over. No more pain. It's just like an information signal to let them know that they lost their arm so they can tend to that problem. And they also don't age and they don't die unless they choose to die themselves, or if their eyes are destroyed, their soul is stored in their eyes. But it's pretty easy to put a strong protective spell just on your eyes. So Finarlum slaves are easily dominated by Darmons, but free Finarlum who study magic can actually become more powerful than anybody. So Finarlum can become excellent sorcerers, and some of them also have telepathic abilities. So considering the abilities and the weaknesses of the races on your world can really play into the theme, or the theme can emerge from them. And just one little quality can have major consequences in the world building. That's something I find so interesting about real history as well as world building a fake history, is that one little event or one little quality can have these huge ripple effects on culture for such a long time. Like, I've done winged people twice now. Once was in Between the Sea and Sky, and they were just inherently had wings in that story. And because of that, they became the post office, basically. They could fly quite fast and easily and cheaply. So they had a messenger service that was a network all over the country. And it was kind of a normal rite of passage, just like here, when you're young, you might take a job at a fast food restaurant. The wing people there, when they're young, almost always are a messenger for a few years to make some money, save up to maybe go to university or start a family. Because of this ability to travel quickly all over the country or the continent, they're known as being rather worldly, always having the latest piece of information, all of the stories and ballads they might have heard on their travels, knowing a lot about different cultures, maybe knowing some extra languages. They also tend to just be a very well-read and learned people anyway, because they're not like physical laborers. They don't have arms, they just have wings and they've got like 2 fingers. So they can hold a pen and they can study things and probably make little detail things that don't require a lot of strength, but they're leaving a lot of physical labor to other races and trading it for their ability to fly. And in the Hidden Lands, the wing people have the same physiology, but instead it comes from shape-shifting, and in this case it came out of their environment. They lived in the mountains, very harsh mountainous terrain, where it was hard to build roads, if not impossible, so they shape-shifted their arms into wings. And that way they could just fly to different ridges, hunting spots, places to settle. And they're kind of the opposite. They don't read or write. They very rarely see outsiders, and they're just like a hunter-gatherer tribe. So you have the same body, and you have 2 different paths for this race that both make sense within the context of where they are and who they are. But either way, all these things kind of work together. And I do seem to have a theme with my own work that I like a lot of transformation and creation in my characters. One of my races is entirely created beings, and then the Darmons transformed themselves, and the wing people transform themselves and basically acquire new properties by using the magic of the world to their advantage. And if you're making a fantasy race for the first time, I would certainly consider what sort of themes you're drawn to and whether you can work that in. If you have a love of nature and plants, your race of people might have a nature magic that works with the plants or animals around them. Maybe they're shifters, maybe they're part animal, maybe they're a plant sort of person. A love of myths and legends might lead you to write about gods or deities with these mythic histories and mythic powers that they're contending with. If you want to play with the role of gender in society, you might want characters who can change their gender or have an extra gender or no gender. I tend to be interested in a lot of different like sociological topics, and the gender roles one was one that came up for me early on. Really on pure accident, but it also fits in with the kind of thing that I'm interested in. When I came up with the doll people, I wasn't really thinking of it from that perspective, but as soon as I started digging into it, I immediately had to wonder, if you're created as a doll person, how does the person who created you decide what your gender is? Or do they wait and let you decide for yourself? Or did they just say you have no gender? Like, someone has to make that decision. Dolls obviously aren't born with reproductive organs or any kind of hormones that would indicate where they fit culturally, but obviously my world, much like ours, has gender roles. So eventually I had to think about it. The Finarlum that were created to just be slaves, to do manual labor, kind of out of sight, out of mind. I don't think anybody would really think about their gender very much. They'd probably just like slap a random, like this one's a he, this one's a she, whatever. They don't even really look very distinct from each other. And then they could probably just change their pronouns if they felt like something else matched and no one would really care. By and large, they're forbidden from like mating or having families or really getting to do anything that would have an effect on that. But when you have the Finarlum concubines or companions, any of them that are going to be interacting regularly with normal society, then it gets tricky because they are made to be ideal representations of a gender, and there are both female and male concubines, but certainly the people who created them would want them to fit the role that they are intending to buy. So it's mentioned a few times that occasionally someone will be raised in one house of concubines and then be switched to a different gender and moved to a different house before the point where they're actually sold. There are also some intersex concubines who seem to embody the roles of both genders so well, they are sent to a different house, which is kind of considered an honor, albeit a dubious one, because they are the most rare and expensive types of concubines. But as several decades pass in the story, slavery ends up being outlawed. And at this point, it's still practiced kind of underground, but raids on these like sweatshops basically happen now and then, and sometimes they'll free a bunch of Finarlum children and people will adopt them, as well as a lot of adult Finarlum or a couple who can't have children or what have you will commission a Finarlum child. So now instead of an indifferent creator just kind of going, we'll call that one she, now you have loving parents having to make these decisions about like, when do I gender my child and how do I make that decision? If you wait for them to decide for themselves, it might be awkward in a society where everyone else, all the flesh and blood kids have a gender and your kid is still figuring out what they are exactly. So it's kind of fascinating to me how all of these questions arose fairly early on in the story, like in the 90s. I didn't explore it very deeply, but no one was talking about this stuff in the 90s at all, which is probably partly why I didn't explore it deeply, because I just didn't even really have like the language or the cultural conception for it. But now our own culture is grappling with a lot of these questions. And in the story, I have characters going about it in different ways and just trying to figure the whole thing out. And there gets to be even more options opening up. Like later on, there's a Finarlum character who has both a male and a female body, and they will just like switch their eyes between the two and kind of embody both of them, as well as I have a married couple that are both asexual and both just kind of, I don't even want to say that they're like non-binary so much as they both kind of live like they're cute little anime characters. Like one of them's definitely like a cute little boy and the other one's like a cute little girl, but they're grown adults and they're just, they're doll people. At this point, they've decided we can do what we want. And we just want our life to be like innocent and super kawaii. And then they have a kid who's like definitely a boy who's very attracted to girls. And they don't know what the heck to do with him. And all of this just evolved from me thinking that Sally was a cool character in Nightmare Before Christmas and being like 11 and wondering, I wonder if Jack and Sally have a love life. And what if I created a whole race of Sallys? And then all the questions that snowball from that basic beginning. And pretty soon you have like 100 deep questions about the very nature of gender and sexuality that just started with, I want to write about Sally. And I'm not sure you can exactly plan all of this. It's probably the most fun when you don't really plan it and you just take one idea like that and you just start like riding it and see where it goes. Start asking questions and pretty soon all of culture is developing from it. And that's another reason why I think Time is one of the greatest things that a world can be gifted, your time, because the longer you spend with it, the more interesting and involved the questions and the cultures become. And then you have like, do you create your own races or do you just riff off of races that people find familiar? I definitely think in a lot of ways it's easier to sell books if you can say, this is a fairy book, this is a vampire book. If people have something familiar to hitch onto and then you just kind of give it your own twist. I do think that's an easier sell because people kind of know what vibe they're getting. As a kid, I used to call the Darmons the demons and the Miralim were the elves. So why did I change that? Well, for starters, the demons just weren't demonic in any way, shape, or form, so it was a very misleading name. They did have tails for a while as well, but that was just because I like drawing tails because Nightcrawler. And eventually I dropped that too because that also seemed misleading. I'm sure that was a relief to everyone in the world trying to shop for pants. And the Miralim, meanwhile, they had also become a little more grounded, a little less mystic and priestessy. And initially they all had these crazy lifespans. As a kid, you're just like, yeah, this character is 50,000 years old and he's a master swordsman and he can manipulate time and space. And he's having some dating troubles right now, okay? And also he's in a band. And then you get older and you really fully realize just how long 50,000 years is. And then you're like, okay, maybe they lived to be like 200 at most. Not that you can't have a story where characters live a really long time or are immortal, but it depends on the type of story that you're trying to tell. Generally, that's going to be either like some kind of very metaphysical story with huge questions about the nature of space and time and the universe itself. Or you're just going to have like a very playful story like, well, maybe the gods, come down to earth, that kind of thing, where you're not really taking the lifespan seriously. My world was serious enough. Then you'll want to consider characteristics based on the environment your characters are living in. Did they come from the Arctic tundra? Did they live in underground caves? Did they come from a sun-baked desert? Did they come from a jungle? This may lead to physical differences in appearance and also adaptations that they may have made, like an aquatic race that might have qualities of the merfolk or sea folk or something like that. And you have the question of whether the magic or the science of the world has any ability to alter them further, like with my winged people in the Hidden Lands. Do they have some ability to really adapt to their environment and perhaps sort of break off from other members of their species? And you might also consider whether there are any personality characteristics inherent to the people, because a lot of fantasy seems to go with something like, well, these are a peaceful people, or they're all good at archery. And sometimes it doesn't really distinguish whether this is a racial species characteristic or whether it is a cultural characteristic. So you might want to ask yourself which it is and why. Like if they have a certain hormone they secrete that makes them more warlike or something, then that would be a species trait. Or if they've always lived underground, but occasionally they come out, but there's some physical consequences to them staying above ground for too long, it might be somewhat of a species trait that they have a paranoia of sunny open spaces or that they grow weaker when they're out above ground. But if it's a cultural trait, then you'll want to think about probably having some characters who break away from those cultural traits, which can be a lot of fun. So these are some of the ways that my fantasy world has evolved and things I would consider. And as with any world building, I think it's best to begin with your area of interest and build from there. If you watched my video on what world building type are you, one reason I started with that video was to hammer home this idea that you can approach world building from so many different angles. You're never going to develop every aspect of your world. So it's always good to bear in mind what really fascinates you, where can you begin and put your most focus on, and then don't get hung up on areas that you're less interested in. Of course, some of you said you're interested in all areas of world building, in which case you'll just kind of have to balance that out. And of course, I would love to know your thought on creating races and species. If you have any interesting original races in your world or any known ones, but you have a bit of a different spin on it, drop that in the comments. And have you ever started with one little thing, like a sort of Sally fanfic that ended up being a exploration of gender roles. It could be anything, but I think that's really fascinating when that happens. Like you have one little goofy fanfic idea and then it turns into a bunch of questions in your head. I'd love to know if that's happened to anybody else. And if you want even more talk, right after this premiere at 7 p.m. Eastern, that's -4 hours GMT, I'll be having a chat night on my Discord, and my Discord is available with my $5 Patreon tier, and if you attend the chat, or really anytime, you can ask any question or talk about anything that you want. We certainly have been. But on chat night, I'm also going to throw out some specific fun questions on fantasy world building, races and species, and stories that you've enjoyed or thought did a good job with it. And this is the first one that I've had, so I don't even know if anybody will show up. But if that happens, maybe I'll just talk to myself for 2 hours. I also have a free weekly Q&A that's available with either my Patreon or my Substack, where I post weekly questions that arise on the YouTube channel and anything else that you want to ask anytime. I appreciate each and every one of you for being here with me today so much. And I will see you again later this week with my video on indie publishing versus traditional publishing, so look out for that. And I wish you the best of luck with all of your creative endeavors. Bye!